Okay, ladies and gentlemen, welcome back to our show, Economics in 40 Easy Lessons, and we're going to pick up from where we started last lesson, which was about the development of economics. And let me remind you that even when ideas are rooted in the 18th century, it doesn't mean that they're not valuable today. But what has happened, and what we're going to explore when we pick up the strings for last lesson, is how Adam Smith's theory has been modified by various findings, trends, and developments that we've had in the 19th, which you've looked at, the 20th, which we're looking at now, and straight into the 21st century and the present day, and what particular concepts influence our economic thinking. Remember that also in economics, what's very important is that it's not a science to the degree that one can easily do a controlled experiment. What economists do is they observe. If they're able to quantify changes, like for example, the national economy of Kuwait went up by 3% between 2018 and 2019. Now, if they can show that, that is what we call in economics a positive statement. I'm going to write this here. That's called a positive economic . Now, translating that into English means that it is something that you can actually test by figures. And if you've made an observation and you can support that by figures or by any other academically acceptable means, then it is positive. For example, if you were able to show that we raised the price of pizzas in the school shop by 50%, from 10 shekels to 15 shekels, for those of us who are watching us from abroad, 1 shekel, they're about 3.5 shekels to the dollar. Right? That should give you the rate of exchange. And in our school, the cost of a pizza has traditionally been 10 shekels. Now, were they to raise this up to 13 shekels, and we found that there are fewer pizzas ordered since the price went up, right? And we can demonstrate that, then we've actually made a contribution to positive economics. The opposite to positive economics, and this doesn't mean it's valuable, is when we talk about normative economics. Normative economic statement. An example of a normative economic statement would be, it would be a good idea for governments to take a greater interest in housing distribution for all classes. It would be a good idea. Can you prove it? Not very easily. Now, you may be able to give some good reasons why that is, but if you're not able to support your statement in economics with figures, and you can demonstrate it, then it is no longer a positive statement. It is what you call a normative statement. Now, this is something that we have to take on board as we examine evidence and things in economics. Do we have enough evidence to be able to say that it is a positive statement? And this takes us back to 20th century economics, because Keynes wanted to demonstrate that if the government intervenes into the national economy in a particular way, and remember what the Keynesian approach was, that the government taxes people, it taxes money that is just being saved and makes it unpleasant to save, lowers the interest rate. It then invests the money into lots of projects, and then as people make money, the money circulates because they spend things on goods and services, and the money circulates quickly and creates jobs. That's the Keynesian idea. If he can actually demonstrate that that actually works, it is a positive statement. Otherwise, until it's actually being put to the test, it is a normative economics because it hasn't actually been demonstrated. That was where we got last time. We got to Keysian economics, and let's just take this off the board, and we will continue our journey. Keynes was writing in the 1930s. Now, as we just left off in our last in our last unit, we come to the anti-Keynesian school, or what is more commonly known as the monetarist school, under Friedman, Milton Friedman, right? And he was in the 1970s, and Friedman's argument was as follows. Like Keynes, and unlike Adam Smith, he believed that the government should take responsibility for managing national prosperity. And a responsible and informed Ministry of Finance in the government can do a much better job than just leaving things to laissez-faire, boom, peak, recession, trough, which was the view of Adam Smith and the classical economists going through the 19th century and already into the 20th. Keynes said this isn't good enough, you can't rely on it, it is for the government to intervene, and Keynes's idea was that the government should spend, and as a result of that, more people are employed and more people are spending money, money circulates more quickly and it creates jobs. Keynes, that is a very, very simplistic, very simple summary of Keynes. As I said last time, very nice when you first heard about it. And it made a very big impression. The trouble was that it wasn't put to the test, as I mentioned very briefly last lesson, until about 40 years later, long after Keynes was dead, but he was still then the main thinking in economics. Why was it not put to the test until the 1970s? For a simple reason. There was no need. During the 1940s, everybody was employed connected with the war. During the 1950s, they were repairing war damage, loads of jobs, no unemployment, no inflation. Inflation meaning no serious inflation. That means that prices were going up. That wasn't happening. Then came the 1960s. At the end of the 1950s and the 1960s was a period when Harold Macmillan told the British people, "You've never had it so good." And you never had it so good. You know why? Prices were still relatively low, even if wages weren't that high, and there was not a problem with unemployment. I mean, you could leave school at 14 and you could walk straight into a job. Okay, it may have not been a very skilled job, it may have not been a very high-paying job, right? But there was still plenty of jobs. The idea of unemployment was not to cross, we heard about in the end of the 20s and the 30s, was no longer to becoming an issue in the West until the 1970s. And the 1970s are remembered as the decade when everything began to go wrong. Strikes and all the rest. Now, in that time, I'll give you one example, the United Kingdom. The United Kingdom, during the 1970s, had a Labour government, which was more left, and they put into practice, broadly speaking, Keynesian policies, high levels of taxes, government involvement in all sorts of things. It didn't bring unemployment down very much. It didn't bring inflation down very much. What happened was that things were just going from bad to worse. The Keynesians argued that the circumstances were slightly different in the 1970s, and they didn't really get a fair chance. However, towards the end of the 70s, you were getting the Friedman School, Chicago, right, based in Chicago. Milton Friedman, who won the Nobel Prize in Economics in I think it was 1977, correct me if I'm wrong, said that this whole idea is very nice in theory, but it doesn't work. There is a much simpler way to get people back at work, or if prices are too high, to bring the prices down. You know what that is? It depends about money. It's called monetary policy. He was a monetarist. People that follow Keynes are simply known as Keynesians. And those who follow the Friedman school, or if you like, the anti-Keynesian policy, right, they understand that the whole thing about whether the economy booms or not, what can the government do? Simple. Place more, if there's not enough money around and people are not buying goods or services, make it easier to borrow money. Now, there are many ways that can be done, but the one we're going to look at now is lower the interest rate. And as I said last lesson, right, that the banks do have some control over what is the rate of interest, and that's something we're going to be looking at when we look at macroeconomics. If there is a lower rate of interest, people borrow money, are much happier to borrow money and to start businesses. Bear in mind that worldwide, at any moment in time, half the world is borrowing money from the other half of the world and paying it back at interest. And the only reason they're prepared to do that is if the interest rates are low, they believe that it'll be worth paying it back at interest because the profits that they will make will more than cover the interest and leave money over. If, however, the economy is growing too fast and everybody's at work and lots of money chasing goods and services and prices are going up, simply raise the interest rate. Then that will mean that the economy will not be working quite as fast. This does not fully do justice to Milton Friedman, because it wasn't just interest rates. But this is a very, very important key, and this was behind the policies of various governments. For example, Margaret Thatcher and Ronald Reagan, right, in the 1980s, were both very, very strongly influenced by the work of the Friedman School, which is that the main tool of controlling how things work is not by excessive taxing or changing the tax rates, but far more in controlling, or the government control over the availability and non-availability of money, e.g. by controlling the interest rate. That got us right through to the 21st century. Now we come to the 21st century. And in the 21st century, right, we are still asking the question, who is right? Right? Is it Keynes or is it Friedman? And we will find that, that even throughout this course, we'll be learning of the case for the Keynesians. We will look at but we're also looking at the case for the monetarists. But economists still fiercely debate how the national economy works. The reason that Keynes came up with his theory is that he understands that the national economy works one way, and the reason that the anti-Keynesians, led by Friedman, came up with a monetarist theory is because that they believe that the national economy tends to work another way. But the national economy has moods. These are all things we're going to be exploring later on in our second main unit, which is macroeconomics. We now come to the 21st century. And whereas in the 21st century, this is not completely questioned. In some cases, governments have gone back to the 19th century, right? American governments, for example, during the 21st century, have gone back to the 19th century and tend to reduce government intervention, and let things just tend to take more care of themselves, as per Adam Smith. But there have been two new developments that have influenced economics in the 21st century. We will look at each of them briefly. The first one is behavioural economics. Right, let me illustrate. Behavioural economics. Now, let me explain. Up till now, we have made a very, very big assumption in economics, which is that people spend their money wisely and sensible, as if they're walking computers, going around with calculators, all aiming to do one thing. How can we get the maximum value for our money? You understand? And that we are rational. And if it makes more sense for us to keep our money in our pocket rather than spend it, we will do so. Let's look at an example. It is Friday. and it is pizza day. And let's say that the pizzas are still running at 10 shekels a pizza. You have bought one pizza. It was a nice cheese and onion one. And you enjoyed it. Then you see there's no longer a line for pizza. And what's happening is there's still a few there that haven't been bought, and they look nice and warm. Tell me if you can relate to this. Should I buy one or shouldn't I buy one? You know what? I'll take one. You eat it, you get about a third of the way through, and then you find that you're satisfied what you can do with the rest of it. You're going to finish it, aren't you? And then by the time you actually get back to your classroom, what's happened? That you don't feel that you're not doing too well during period 3 because one pizza was fine, and that was good value for 10 shekels, but you didn't really get good value for 10 shekels the second time round. What you got was you feel a bit over bloated and you got a bit of a stomachache. That's not what you wanted to spend 10 shekels on, was it? Now, if you'd have thought about it, you know how much you can eat, can't you? But we don't think about it, do we? We go by the smell, we go by the appearance, we go by the fact that it's Friday, that it's pizza day. So therefore, we are not rationally spending our money. Does all that make sense to you? We're not always rational. Give you another example. Supermarkets know this. And this is called, and this is the economics, by the way, of Richard Thaler, right, which, that's the main name. Richard Thaler won the Nobel Prize, he was the representative, won the Nobel Prize for Economics in 2017. Right? Richard Thaler, and his view is that the reason that we actually spend money is because we give a little nudge, not a nudges. You're not told to spend money, but we have various ways of persuading you to spend the money. For example, you go into the supermarket. Where in the supermarket are all the sweeties and all the candies and all the chocolate eggs and all the other nice little tidbits? Where do they normally put them?
The front.
Right at the cash? No, not usually. They put a few attractive things. But you know what it's like when you're lining up at the till? You see all those nice sticks of chewing gum and all the nice little goodies, and perhaps these fairy cakes and meringues and one or two other things you shouldn't really be having, right? Or at least a lot of us shouldn't be having, and we wouldn't dream of buying at the beginning. But when we're actually lining up in the supermarket and we haven't got anything else to do apart from looking at the trolley in front, which is a bit, oh, I just have a bit of this, or I just take a bit of that, which we wouldn't normally do. Now, when we get home, you sort of ask yourself, why on earth did I buy this? But that's not what we were thinking at the time, because we were given a little nudge. Right, and that is the theory of behavioural economics. That a lot of our spending is to do with the nudge that our environment gives. Do you now understand that? So that gets us through. The situation until well into the 21st century. The idea that it's not just individuals, but it's also other people. It's also governments can make similar mistakes, especially when they're under pressure to deliver something before the next election, that they don't necessarily make the best economic decisions, right? So all the idea that came from Adam Smith, right? Adam Smith's idea, which was that it is people and governments and everybody else makes rational economic decisions are not particularly backed up by reality. However, and this is the important point, even if they're not backed up with reality, right, they are patterns in the way that people behave. For example, supermarkets have found out to their continuing profit that people make irrational decisions if they put the right things at the moment that they're most likely to be tempted to. Right? For example, the chocolate cakes are not going to be so much at the entrance, but they're going to be when people have already done their shopping. They've picked up their diet kale, they've picked up their diet lettuce, they've picked up their diet everything else. Ooh, that chocolate cake, gotta have it. Normally they wouldn't do it, but subtle advertising but subtle advertising can lead them to do it. Right, now as we now come to the last school, we now come to the last school of economics, the last main idea, which is the environmental school. The environmental school in economics says another challenge, which is limits to growth. Right? Let me just put this at the bottom. We'll also put behavioural economics, and we will also put limits to growth and the environmental one, and that is Kate Raworth, Professor of Economics at the University of Oxford. Now, let us have a look and bring Kate Raworth's work onto the screen. There we go. Let's take this off, take all the background. Actually, can we manage with the background? It looks messy. So what we'll do is we'll take the background off and we will explore Kate Raworth's contribution to economics. She has actually taken the world by storm because her work is of not only interest to economists but to everybody else. Has Kate Raworth got the right solution? Take all this off. All clean. Kate Raworth's model is known simply as the Doughnut Model. As there, donuts. Here's your donuts, and there are the various things that are on the inside of the donut and on the outside of the donut. Let us explain what Kate Raworth's model is and what her vision is and what her understanding is. Kate Raworth argues as follows. She is the first, her school that she represents is the first school in economics that challenges the following idea. We need economic growth. We need to be able to produce more and more. Kate Raworth's words, she says it through her donut, is hold it a moment, see what you're doing, and see that you're acting in harmony with your environment. What does that mean? Let's look at the centre of the donut. Right? We are 7.5 billion people on the planet. And her aim is, and we're all living in this donut, we want safe and just space for humanity. That doesn't mean everybody gets the same, but it does mean that there's a certain fairness to who gets what. It's not a few millionaires have got everything, right, and the rest are living in scraping poverty or even below scraping poverty. And at the bottom, the economy must be regenerative and distributed. If it is a regenerated economy, that means that we grow food year one for the world, and we look after the soil, and then we grow food year two for the world, and we look after the soil. And as long as the sun is shining, the food will always be regenerate, and there will always be enough. That is a regenerative economy. And also, that obviously some people are going to have more, some people are going to have less. But it shouldn't get to the point where the distribution fails to the degree that we get malnutrition and starvation. That's what she wants. That's the aim of economics. The aim of economics is a safe and just space for humanity, and it should have a regenerative and distributive economy. Now, let's have a look. In order to do that, the world inside the donut should be right, and the world outside the donut should be right. In order for the world to work, there should be social equity. That does not mean the same as equality. Equity means that it should be fair, right? That people should have fair access to opportunities and jobs and ways of being able to earn a living. Right? Some people will, basic things like education, healthcare, and so on. Some people will have more, some people will have less. Right? It doesn't have to be equal, but it has to be reasonably fair. People should have a political voice. Right, go on. They should have education, access to health, water, food, energy, housing, and so on. Generally, gender equality. In other words, there should be basic standards. A woman shouldn't feel that the world has become her that the world is closed to her just because of her gender. This unfortunately is the case in many parts of the world, where there is a ceiling as to what is socially acceptable and culturally acceptable for the female members of society to partake. This is the inside. This has to be healthy, and the aim is that every country should be able to satisfy the inside of the donut. This is what it should be. This, if you like, is the normative model. If things are bad, then there's a shortfall. There's something wrong. It has to be attended to. So far we looked at the inside of the donut. Now let's look at the outside of the donut. At the outside of the donut is what happens if we overshoot. We do certain things too well. Then the environment can't serve us anymore. For example, we dump too much stuff in the ocean. It becomes acid. That means that the fish don't survive. We've got dangerous things with climate change. We get too much ultraviolet light coming because of the ozone layer, which can be very harmful. And that means that it threatens both the animal and the plant population. Right? Pollution. Right? Biodiversity loss. Lots of species that we need, right, no longer exist. Other things. Land conversion. There's not enough land at forestry, right, to be able to give us enough carbon dioxide. Do you understand? These are the costs of growth. Growth is an expensive business. In other words, yes, we should have growth, but we have to have growth within the limits of what the planet can sustain. In other words, we would say that Kate Raworth's model is sustainable growth. Now, that's what Kate Raworth would like. When we're not pushing things too far, that we're threatening all these things, outside threats, and when the inside is okay, we will have a global society that is safe and just, and that is regenerative and distributive. That's what she would like. And that is based on sustainability. Sustainability means that you can help yourself and you can use the resources. Just make sure that you manage them in such a way that when the next generation comes, you haven't destroyed them. In other words, don't kill the goose that lays the golden eggs. Right? Keep those goose